Item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda and any announcements. Do we have any announcements? All right. Agenda. Do we need to modify the agenda other than the way it is currently written? Hearing no modifications, do we have a motion?
Move to approve the agenda.
Do we have a second?
I'll second. Oh, sorry.
Motion. Well, we've got seconds and thirds.
Oh.
We have a motion and a
Aaron
second. Okay. All those in favor of approving the agenda for October 28th, 2025, as written, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes for October 9th, 2025. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any modification or changes that need to be done in the minutes? All right. All those, excuse me, all those in favor of approving the minutes for October 9th, 2025, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. We'll now open the floor for public comment. And we will close the public comment. And so next item on the agenda, actual valuation. Welcome, Siegel team.
Thank you.
Excellent. I might just kick it off quickly, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely.
So this, what we have for you today is the annual valuation report as well as an accompanying presentation. And I think Matt and team will go over the presentation, but that effectively summarizes the longer, more in-depth valuation report, which itself, just as a reminder for folks who have seen it before and folks who are new, has got a wealth of information in the main body of the report, but also in the back matter, the appendices. There's a really good summary of plan terms, the assumptions that we utilized, financial data, all that stuff. So a good resource to page through when you have the time, especially after hearing this report. We've been working on this for the past couple months. I say we, but it's primarily Siegel that's been doing the work on this. And just to let everyone know where this fits in, we have a deadline of November 1st for the treasurer to send a letter over to the General Assembly and the governor to let them know about the funded status of the plan, and more importantly, the annual contribution needed in the upcoming fiscal year. So this is that first step that lets us know, how the plan's been running over the last year, but also informs that look forward where we have to fund the plan at an appropriate level for fiscal 27. So very pleased with the report and happy to have Siegel present it to you today. With that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. So I'm joined by a few of my colleagues, Patrick Tabernacki, Austin Miller, and a newer member to the team, Maria Manakarakis, who helped out last year, and we wanted her to join and get to meet you all today. And I'm going to walk through our presentation. I'll share my screen for you right now. So the idea here is we're going to start with just a minute or two of background, knowing that, like we do this every day of the year, but understanding that the valuation shows up for you once a year. So we want to get everyone back on the terms, the language that we're using, and then we'll dive into some of the inputs into the valuation and reviewing the results themselves. So I like this graphic that shows what goes into the valuation process. It's on a snapshot date, and we use June 30th of each year. And so we really have 5 input items into the process. It goes into the Siegel black box, and then it spits out a lot of great information that we report in our valuation report and in this presentation. A couple of the items of those 5 input items, the member data and the financial data, are refreshed every single year. So that's really what takes the longest is for us to collect the membership data from you all, from the system, and then reconcile that with the prior year. And then, of course, we're waiting on some financial information to be finalized as of June 30. The other items there's funding methodology. That's how the money gets into the plan, how the contributions are calculated, and that's defined by statute. We revisit that periodically and just review it to make sure we're understanding it and following it appropriately. Benefit provisions change every once in a while, but when they do, we reflect any new benefit provisions within the valuation year that they're adopted. And then actuarial assumptions are the 5th input item, and we're going to talk about those in a bit, but they're on a cycle of revision. For every 3 years. We review them in full and then make recommendations, which the board generally adopts our recommendations, and they get used in the valuation. A lot of output items, but the ones that I think really stick out are we calculate an accrued liability, an unfunded accrued liability, and then we're able to calculate a funded percentage. And so the funded percentage is a point in time measurement of how much assets are on hand to cover the liability, and a history of that is a progress of how the funded ratio has moved, and we're going to show you what that has looked like over time. But really the big one is the projected budgeted contribution for fiscal 27. So this 25 valuation develops the contribution for fiscal 27. I like this slide here to show that really we've got all these funding methodologies, but the real cost of the system are the benefits, and to a lesser extent, the administrative expenses to support the system. And so the valuation is a budgeting tool of how we can allocate costs. For teachers that, let's say, were hired just this last year, this is their first school year. Hopefully they're a member of the system for maybe another 75 or 80 years. And so we have payments that go out to them and their beneficiaries for their lifetimes, and the valuation reflects all those future payments and discounts them to present value. So it's like, well, how do we fund that? And that's what the valuation does, is it sets up a schedule of being able to fund and allocate costs at different time periods. So when we say things like, you might hear, well, we revised our assumptions and the assumptions increased the cost of the system. I always feel like that's a bit of a misnomer, because it's really the cost of the system is what drives the cost of the system, and the assumptions are there to help us plan a more appropriate budget for how those contributions get paid over time. The assumptions that we use are really divided into 2 categories. We've got demographic assumptions that I think they drive which members will ultimately retire from the system, and what their benefit amount will be when they retire, and how long that benefit will get paid for. And then on the other side, we have economic assumptions. So those are things like, the underlying inflation assumption, which drives COLA, it drives salary increases, it drives investment return is probably the biggest one there. And we do have an assumption for COLA, which is based on inflation. Our data, as we said, is based on June 30th of 2025. But early in the fall, we know what the CPI increases are that are actually going to affect COLAs as of January 1 of 26. So we do factor in that new COLA at least on the first year's benefit payments. And so that is something that's not baked into last year's valuation. And so to the extent that the 1 year of known COLA that's not already reflected in benefit amounts is higher or lower than expected, that creates a gain or loss. And you can see by, the assumption is that for Group A members, for example, we assume 2.3%. Groups B and C members, we assume 1.2%. Those actually, the actuals for 26 ended up being 3% and 1.5% respectively. So that drives a little bit of a liability loss just from reflecting the one known COLA that's out there. This page talks about the actuarial methods, and we've discussed these before, but there's three components of a funding policy. And the asset valuation method, that allows us to be able to use a smooth value of assets to determine the funded status and the contribution amount, rather than the market value, which, as we know, can be volatile from year to year. And so we're effectively using what qualifies as a 5-year smoothing method, and you'll be able to see later on of how well that has worked to smooth out the bumps in the investments. So for budgeting purposes, we're able to use a more smooth value of assets. The cost method is how all of the projected benefits that are out there are allocated to past and future service, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. We do use a very common method called entry into normal, which is a very budget-friendly method. And then lastly, the amortization. So when there's unfunded liability that's out there, when there's accrued liability without enough assets to cover it, you need to have a plan to deal with that. The statute does have a plan, and currently the plan is to pay down all unfunded liability by the end of 2038. Which is 13 years away. So we calculate an amortization payment, and it's based on an increasing schedule. So unlike a home mortgage, which is typically a level dollar amount over the course of your loan, this is scheduled to have payments that increase by 3% per year. So I did want to talk about, give a high level view of the funding process. If you think about it on a single member, all of those projected, we look at a person's career from when they're hired to when they retire or when they're expected to retire, and all of their cash flows, their benefit payments, are discounted back to any point in their career, and that's called the present value of future benefits, the present value of total future benefits. You can divide that up by, the service that's earned as of the valuation date. We allocate all those costs and call that the actuarial accrued liability. And then for all of our active members who still have expected future service, before they retire, all the present value of all those costs are called present value of future normal costs. Our retiree group, they're not earning any more service, so their accrued liability is equal to their total present value of benefits. But the active members, we want to allocate a portion to past service, and then we want to allocate a portion of future normal costs to the current year, and that's our annual normal cost, which is effectively the value of the benefit of their total present value of benefits that's allocated to the current fiscal year. So thinking about that in an entire group and how the actuarially determined contribution is made for all of our members, we have an entire pie here of total present value of future benefits. For the active members that they have expected service out there that they haven't earned, the present value of that is taken out. And so everything else is the accrued liability, and we have this portion down at the bottom that we're expected to cover out in the future. As far as the accrued liability, we have an actuarial value of assets that covers some or most of that, but whatever is remaining from that actuarial accrued liability that's not covered by assets, we call the unfunded liability. And so thinking about how we would actuarially develop a contribution, and again, this is also mirrored in statute. We would take a portion, this year's normal cost is a portion of what we want to pay in the actuarially determined contribution. And then we also want to amortize down a portion of any unfunded liability as the second component of our contribution. So the actuarially determined contribution, we call it the budget contribution, but it generally consists of those two components. A normal cost piece that pays for the benefits that are allocated to the current year or any future year, and the amortization of unfunded liability. So with that background, we'll jump into a quick summary of the valuation highlights, and then the team will take over and talk about really the details of it. But the
Hey,
market
Matt.
value, yes.
Matt, do you want to just pause and see, because I know we're open to taking questions along the way. Do you want to just pause and see if anyone had anything,
I do want to do that.
questions?
And yeah, if please, as we're talking, we should do questions as we're moving along. So any questions on that background? The coolly animated exhibits. Okay, yeah, please just jump in for any one of us that as we're going through. The market value of asset return, and again, this should be really close to what VPIC had reported, but we kind of use an oversimplification for cash flows that things happen like in the middle of the year, which is going to be different than how they do it. But we calculate an 11.15% return on market value, which is outstanding. I'd mentioned the smoothing mechanism. So Patrick's going to go over really how that value, the actuarial smooth value, is calculated, because it's sort of interesting. But once it's calculated and we smooth out the gain, so the 11.15 versus 7, so effectively like 4.15% of that gain is being smoothed out into time. We recognize a little bit now, and then we smooth the rest out into the future. But we have our new actuarial value, and then we have last year's actuarial value, and we know the cash flows that happen. So we can basically calculate an implied return on the actuarial value of assets, although that's not really money that earns a return. We can impute a return on it. And that ended up being 7.78%. So that really gets directly compared to the 7% assumption in the valuation. And so it's going to show that we had a gain on actuarial assets to those 78 basis points that exceeded it. Still, for the purposes of the valuation, we are excluding the value that's allocated for the post-retirement adjustment allowance account, the PA. That ended up being about $10.3 million. So we pulled that out of the valuation. We're keeping track of that separately for, applying interest to those contributions, but we're excluding that from the valuation assets. The funded ratio on an actuarial basis, the smooth basis.
Matt, quick question for you. So when
Yeah.
you pull that amount from the post-retirement adjustment, does that help with unfunded liability at all?
It doesn't change the unfunded liability, but we're also not including, so that money is designed to pay for a certain benefit that's contingent in the future, and we're not valuing that liability either. So the money that's being set aside for that, we're also not valuing, if that makes sense. So effectively, I mean, it's not intended to have any, it's not designed, it ultimately may, but it's not designed to have any unfunded liability associated with it. So right now you could theoretically say the value of that liability is 10.3 million. So we're excluding the liability and we're excluding the assets from it. Tim, if you have a better way to describe that.
Thanks.
No, I think that's fair. One note I will make about the, and I don't know if you'll get into this later, but this is the first year so last year there was an amount in this account, but it was the first contribution and there hadn't been any application of investment return to it. So this is the first year we had last year's contribution. I think it was around 8.8 million or 8 point something million. And then we have a contribution this year, and we've had some investment return on it. The 10.3 is not the actual amount in the account. It's like the returns that Siegel applies to the main fund for actuarial purposes. This 10.3 includes some assumptions. I think the actual amount in the PAAA as of year end is slightly less than this. Austin and I have had a number of conversations about how to incorporate this into whether you use actual amount or the constructed amount using these assumptions. This is a new thing for us this year. The differences are small. I just pointed out because it's something we'll be working on. We may refine next year. Wouldn't make any kind of substantial difference really in the figures we're reporting, but I just wanted to flag it as still a work in progress because this is a new thing following Act 114.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't think we go into that detail here. It's in the evaluation report, but right, we effectively take last year's contribution and apply the return, the actual, market return to it. So we kind of have a little side fund that we're keeping track of that value, and then we subtract it out of the market value.
Yeah.
The funded ratio there, and this is again the smooth value, increased from 61.17 to 63.43%. So seeing an improvement in the actuarial funded ratio is good news. The contribution requirement, we call the value that we calculate for the current fiscal year, we call that the preliminary contribution requirement, because if we certified on that basis, it's too late because we wouldn't be able to get that in. So there's a timing adjustment that we live with in the valuation, which we effectively calculate the ADEC for the current fiscal year and then effectively apply that to projected payroll for fiscal 26, the rate, and apply it to fiscal 27. And we'll show how that works later. But that rate actually decreased from 25.57% of pay to 25.47% of pay. So we show what that is in terms of dollars. The real number that we're actually, kicking out of this valuation process, as the contribution requirement is at the bottom there. That's the estimated fiscal 27 contribution. It's not really, it's only estimated because we're projecting it out, but that's really the top line number of this valuation is the $220.9 million amount. And I think, and you'll see when we show this later that we take the preliminary amount, which is technically for fiscal 26, we apply it to fiscal 27. That rolls out the 220.9. And then we also show, well, what does it look like for just the next year? So for fiscal 28. And so in last year's valuation, we did that, and we showed what we thought the fiscal 27 number would look like, but based on last year's valuation, that ended up being 217.5. So it's only slightly higher it's like what, $3 million higher, 3 million and change higher from what was projected last year. So that tells you that, and even knowing that we reflected an investment gain, that tells you there's going to be some other minor adverse experience, worse than expected on the demographic side. I've already hinted at one of them is the COLA that drives a loss, because we reflected that in there as well. But that'll be one of the things that we'll talk about. But all in all, it's fairly consistent with what was projected last year, which just kind of goes to say that there was some refreshed in the valuation, so showed some changes, but overall it's basically in line with what was expected prior year, but just a little bit higher. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Austin to talk a little bit about those inputs. The first input item, which is the membership.
Sure. So starting on this slide, this just summarizes how the membership information has changed from fiscal year 2025 compared to fiscal year 2024. The number of active members slightly decreased by about 0.4%. Total payroll increased by 4.5%. And there was a small increase in the average age and average service amount of roughly 0.2 years. For retirees and beneficiaries, the total number increased by 1.4% this year. Total annual benefits also increased by 4.5%, which ultimately produced an increase in the average monthly benefit amount of roughly 3.1%. So then on the next slide, we can see how the number of active members, the number of retirees and beneficiaries has fluctuated since 2015. Regarding the number of active members, back in 2009, which isn't shown on this graph, but that's when active membership reached its peak of 10,799 members. And in recent years, the active count is close to reaching that level again. As you can see, we're at 10,526 this year. For the number of retirees and beneficiaries, it's been pretty steadily increasing since 2015, up to 10,772 members in 2025. As a result of these trends in member counts, the ratio of retirees and beneficiaries to active members has increased from roughly 0.89 in 2015 up to 1.02 in 2025. And this ratio is important to monitor because as the ratio of retirees and beneficiaries to active members increases, there's greater risk for the system because there are limited options available to reduce the liabilities for retirees and beneficiaries in the event of adverse experience. So then on the next slide, this slide illustrates how the covered payroll amounts, which are also known as the actual compensation received by members during a fiscal year, compared to the projected payroll amounts, which were projected from or via the active membership data from the prior fiscal year. In 2025, the actual compensation received was $809.1 million, which ended up being quite close to the projected payroll amount of $810.9 million, which was projected via the prior fiscal year. Since 2015, active payroll has increased on average by about 3.8% per year. This slide illustrates how the average age, average service, and average hire age have changed since 2015. The average age has slightly decreased over the years from about 46.2 in 2015 down to 45.7 in 2025. Similarly, the average service has also slightly decreased from 12.9 in 2015 to 12.3 in 2025. And then on the other hand, the average hire age has remained pretty level throughout the entire period. It's been just over 33 years old. And these trends just kind of indicate that as time progresses, older members are with greater service amounts are gradually being replaced by younger members with lower service amounts. And then now this slide just compares how the average salary amount and the average benefit amounts have changed over the years since 2015. Since 2015, both average salary and the average annual benefit have increased on average by about 2.8% per year. So the changes on a percentage basis have been pretty consistent for both the average salary and the average benefit since 2015. Now, on the next slide, I'll pass it over to Patrick to begin discussing the asset information.
I guess any questions on the demographic side before I talk about assets? Okay. So Matt touched on some of the high-level asset values in the highlights section earlier, but I'm going to talk about the assets in a little more detail in the next few slides. So the market value of assets increased from 2.81 billion as of 2024 to 3.13 billion as of 2025. And as Matt mentioned, Siegel's estimate of the investment return for that period is 11.15% on a market value basis. Looking over at actuarial value, that value also increased from 2.82 billion to 3.04 billion, and the investment return on the actuarial value basis is 7.78%, and that's compared to our 7% investment return assumption. The actuarial value is currently 97.2% of the market value, and this is because there's a total of $87.8 million in deferred net investment gains that will be recognized in future years. The bottom of the slide shows average annual returns under both the actuarial and market value. So under actuarial value, the 5-year average return is 7.2%, and the 20-year average is slightly lower at 6.5%. And the market value 5-year average is 8.7%, and the 20-year is 6.9%. If you compare to this table to the last few years, there's been nice improvement given the higher than expected returns in recent years. So this graph shows how the market value of assets is reconciled from year to year. So the blue bars in this graph are cash flows that increase the assets, and the orange bars are decreases. So looking at the fiscal 2025 section, the beginning of year asset value is 2.8 billion. That's shown with the green bar in the middle there. Employer and member contributions totaled $272 million. And that's compared to 275 million last year, which generally remain level. Benefit payments totaled $263 million, and that's compared to 254 million in the prior year, which is an increase of 4%. And the net investment income totaled 309 million compared to 260 last year. So the first 3 bars in the fiscal 25 section consists of the contributions and benefit payments, and the sum of those result in slight positive cash flow. So most of the increase in the market value is entirely due to the investment income or the 10.7% return on assets. So with these cash flows, the market value of assets as of the current valuation ends up being $3.1 billion. So this slide shows how the actual value of assets is developed. So as Matt mentioned, the actual value is a smoothing method such that market fluctuations are not fully recognized in a single year. So using the asset smoothing method results in a more stable asset value and therefore a more stable contribution or ADEC. So the prior year actuarial value was $2.8 billion, just over. Net new money for the year was 201 million, and you can think of net new money as essentially being the sum of cash flows, which includes contributions, interest, investment income, minus benefit payments and expenses. So the preliminary asset value is the sum of the prior year value and the net new money, which results in just over $3 billion. So the next step is where the smoothing adjustment comes into play. We compare the actual market value of assets with the preliminary asset value, and the difference is the portion that is unrecognized, and in this case, it's a gain of $110 million. So we recognize 20% of that amount immediately, and the remaining will be deferred in future years. So we recognize $22 million of gains and add it to the preliminary asset value, and that results in an actuarial value of $3.038 billion, which is 97.2% of the market value. And there's still about $88 million of deferred gains to be recognized in future years. So the graph on this slide does a good job of depicting how the smoothing of the market value of assets actually works. So the light blue line is the return on market value of assets, and it shows quite a bit of volatility since 2015. There's a high of 26.6% return in 2021 and a low of negative 8.9% in 22. So the dark blue line is the actuarial value return, and it's much more stable. The purple line is the assumed rate of return in the given year, and you can see that the actual value returns better hug the assumed rate of return line. It just kind of shows how the smoothing works. So the graph on this slide shows the system's history of the investment return assumption and compares it against other public plans that are part of the public fund survey as of November 2024. You see gradual decreasing of the investment return assumption over the years. VPIC's assumption is currently 7%, and that's right at the median of the public fund survey, with the average being just below at 6.9%. So generally speaking, most of the plans you're seeing 6.75% and 7% range of the investment return assumption. So the graph on this slide shows how the system's historical contributions have compared to benefit payments and expenses. So since 2015, benefit payments have been around $30 to $60 million higher than total contributions. And that's until the recent 4 years where there's been additional funding from Act 114 in 2022 and beyond. So since then, contributions have been close to and or exceeding benefit payments and expenses. This trend is likely to continue in future years, given the additional contributions from Act 114, which are actually included in the total contributions shown on this slide. This graph builds off the prior slide, but instead represents the net cash flow as a percentage of market value. So the system has been improving its net cash flows over the last several years. Although negative cash flows are not uncommon for mature plans like this system, especially where the retiree population is increasing like it is. But this system has become cash flow positive over the last 4 years, which is a very favorable position to be in. Once again, that's mostly attributable to the Act 114 contributions in the last several years.
So any questions on the asset side?
Matt,
I'm
I
gonna
think
s-
maybe just to make the point that, with our cash flows where they are and being where we are in the amortization period with 13 years left, I mean, I think the point to make here is that this is where we really make progress on the unfunded liability, kind of getting to this place. You didn't see it really coming down significantly, but I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's fair to say that this is now where we start to expect to see that funded percentage go up and up, given the fact that we're not having to use any investment income to pay for benefits.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we did a lot of that modeling in the spring with the risk study that showed kind of what it takes to, I mean, all the paths based on the current funding policy and statute, we're racing to that 100% funded percentage by 2038. And this is the time in those last dozen years where that's going to happen. So and the additional contributions are accelerating that. So we're gonna see how that plays out in the amortization schedule in a couple slides. But yeah, I agree. This is the time that the unfunded liability is going to get quickly paid down over these next 13 years, and we're going to see the funded percentage start to increase.
And then also getting the investment return above the assumption, having that being there and smoothed out to level that ride along with the increase of the contributions. I think it couldn't play any better.
It's a beautiful thing.
And 6 years ago, I'm not sure I would have had this conversation.
Right. No, it's nice that the markets have done pretty well and VPIC has done well. I mean, everyone had a bad year. What was that, like in 21 or something? But
Yeah.
The last couple of years have been favorable. So, and even with bringing in some of the, still kind of reflecting the loss, the last couple of years where the market return beat 7, I think we still had losses on the AVA, but I like this year where we had a gain on both. So kind of getting towards the home stretch here, but now getting into calculating the liabilities. So these pie graphs show the liability and the accrued liability and its allocation among the different status groups. The most recent valuation is on the left, and last year's valuation is on the right. And so you can see the total accrued liability here is now is just shy of $4.8 billion. And last year is right around 4.6. So there was an increase that's not unexpected because the normal cost component, everyone earning a year of service accrual, that increases liability. We pay benefits, which decreases it, but then we're shortening the interest discount period. So the present value has a tendency to increase because of it, because of the shorter discounting period. But I think it's interesting to look at the different components of the 4.8, 2.9, so certainly over 50, close to 60% of the liability is attributable to retired members that are in payment status, so retirees and beneficiaries and so forth. There's a small sliver of about $160 million that's due to inactive members. Those are folks that have no longer active, but they also weren't able to they didn't meet the requirements for retirement, so they're out there and due a pension when they become eligible, when they meet the age requirement to become eligible for a pension. And then the remaining portion is just over 1.7 billion that's attributable to active members. And although the amounts are different, the shape is very similar to the way it was last year. And so then as we start to think about the assets, we layer on the actuarial value of assets and kind of starting at the top. So they're, as Patrick mentioned, they're just over $3 billion. And so when you think about it in terms of like the liability that it covers, it effectively covers all the liabilities for current retirees and beneficiaries and almost all the liabilities for the inactive members, but it doesn't quite touch the active member liability. So you can see it's right at about 63.4% funded ratio. And again, that compares last year to 61.2. So last year it was basically just enough to cover the retiree liability. This year we picked up quite a bit of the liability for the inactive members in improving that funded ratio. And then we always do like to track, we report things on an actuarial basis, but we don't want to keep our head in the sand and ignore market value. So we do look at market value as well. And as we know that the return on market value was even better. So there's 3.126 billion of market value of assets. That actually does end up covering all the retirees, beneficiaries, and inactives, and starts getting into a little bit of the active liability there. So it leaves 1.66 billion unfunded on a market value basis, and 1.75 billion unfunded on an actuarial basis. But the funded ratio on that market basis is 65.3%, whereas last year it was 61%. So quite a bit of improvement on the market value funded ratio. Again, when you get a 11+% return, good things happen.
So Matt just showed us the assets, liabilities, and funded percentages for the last 2 years, but this slide will show a longer history going back 10 years. Looking at the graphic, the liability in the dark blue shading is shown to typically be increasing smoothly, and the years where it isn't is generally due to the following of an experience study or any changes to the assumptions that have been made. The actuarial value of assets is illustrated to have a smoother pattern than the market value of assets, which is why it is preferred for determining contributions, and it is due to the actuarial smoothing method being used. Overall, your assets are growing at a higher rate than your liabilities, which in turn is helping the funded ratio improve.
Yeah, Maria, I'll kind of circle those years where it doesn't look smooth on the liabilities. We implemented assumption changes here, which I think was like a change in the mortality, and then I think there was a change in discount rate here, which was the next bump. There was an experience study here. It didn't have a huge impact. I think might have actually been a slight decrease in liability, which you can see from the graph. But those are our years where we had experience studies, and otherwise, it's like Maria said, it's very smooth.
So focusing on the actual value funded ratio, due in part to returns and any of the assumption changes, the funded ratio dropped from about 59% in 2015 to 51% in 2020. However, as we can see, starting in 2021, that funded ratio has started to improve steadily and continuously.
Yeah, perfect. Well, hopefully we think this is going to keep going up until we get to that 2038 target.
And I think this, the note here that it's the highest funded ratio since 15, I think is just related to the fact that the graph is only going back to 2015. I think looking back further, this is actually the highest point since 2011. So
That's
really,
a fair point.
Really good news story with this year's Val.
So we kind of thinking back to those pie graphs and the components of our actuarially determined contribution and how they relate to what we call the preliminary contribution requirement. We do have our total normal cost, and I think one of the beautiful things about entry age normal method is that it does try to be a level cost method. And so without any other changes, you would expect the normal cost rate to be the same, but we refresh the demographics, and that when you do that, you get slight differences. But really, it ended up just being 12 basis point difference increase. So that's not terribly unexpected. But the total normal cost rate went up, and then the average member rate, again, shifting around with just the different dynamics there, went up from 6.75% to 6.82%. And so when we net those out, we're really focusing on, for determining the state contribution, we're looking at the employer normal cost rate, or the employer's share of normal cost. And that stayed relatively constant year over year. It was 4.96 last year, up to 5.01% this year. We did see a drop in the amortization payment as a percentage of payroll, went from 20.6 down to 20.46%. And so that's where we're seeing, this 10 basis point drop in the contribution requirement. We do show a reconciliation of those 10 basis points in the table below. So like, for example, the first number is all the percentages. I think the first, what is it, five numbers on this table are all based on the dollar change divided by last year's payroll. And so we expected the amortization payment by statute increases by 3%. So that dollar amount of increase gets divided on the same payroll basis as the last year's contribution. So it looks like it would have been a 62 basis point increase in contribution on last year's denominator effectively. So that was like an expected amount. There were more contributions that came in than the ADEC, slightly more. So that pulls down the contribution requirement by 17 basis points. The gain on the actuarial value actually brings the rate down by 27 basis points. Things like the COLA and some of the other experience that we'll show you in a couple slides that resulted in demographic losses kind of went the other way. Salaries was one that was big, so the liabilities associated there, they increased that. Again, in terms of last year's payroll, they increased that by 59 basis points. The last item is kind of a catch-all that says, well, we got to take all those numbers and convert them to this year's payroll basis. So there's a few things out there that fall into this balancing item, but that's one of them, is going from dividing by last year's payroll to the new amounts divided by into this year's projected payroll. So there's a bit of offsetting, I think, from the 59 to the 87. But that's what nets out to the different changes. I always think about as primarily these three that are fairly easy to explain, the second, third, and fourth items. And then as we go to the next page, keep in mind the employer normal cost rate of 5.01% from our funding scheme. We can think of that as being level into the future. So as we project out the contribution, the preliminary amount, and try to get an estimate, a projected amount for fiscal 27 and fiscal 28, we can maintain the same normal cost rate because, again, it's theoretically level, although valuations will prove that it's slightly different. But it's theoretically level, so we're happy keeping that at 5.01, and then we just bump up the payroll by 3% assumption. So we're getting, fiscal 27 projected payroll of 872 million, and then for our next year that we're getting fiscal 28 payroll of about $899 million. So that's one multiply those out, and you get the first part of our budget contributions is the employer normal cost dollar amount. And then we have this amortization schedule. So the unfunded liability on an actuarial basis is this 1.75 amount. And then there was the additional contribution, we expect for this year to be 15 million. And then the amortization payment that's applicable for fiscal 26, that was calculated in last year's valuation. So in last year's schedule, the second number down was this 171. So we take those as kind of known amounts and we roll forward to an end of year projected unfunded of 1,681 million. And then we kind of run through and amortize that. So we calculate an amortization payment, amortizing that over the remaining, 12 years. And then we apply another $15 million. So this 15 is always there until the funded percentage is over 90%, and then it drops to zero. So we're keep continually rolling forward these balances with a newly calculated payment, and then a $15 million amount. Once those 15s drop off and we're left here with a new payment of 201.8 million, then the subsequent two payments are exactly 3% higher. So we don't have that interaction of calculating an amount and then being able to apply some additional amount that allows us to re-amortize the next year's payment. But effectively, now that we've calculated an amount for, this is as of July 1, 26, which is basically fiscal 27. So our fiscal 27 amount of 177.1 drops down to here. And then the next year's rung, fiscal 28, 180.7, drops down into our table. So that's how we come up with our $220.9 million contribution amount for fiscal 27 is the sum of those two components. It's the amortization piece for the year and our projected value of employer normal costs for the year. So that's 220.9, and then kind of thinking out for the next year, we would estimate $225.8 million. And then we did want to show a history of gain loss by year. We are scheduled to do an experience study next year, which will take all the experience from the year that just ended and the 2 prior years, and then compare that to what our expectations were. And so we do look at the demographic experience and the gain loss every year just to see how we're tracking, and we don't want there to be any surprises in that process. But you can see, post 2022 that we've actually had some turnover gains. It was losses prior to that. We're still seeing some retirement losses. Those are generally people retiring earlier than expected and drawing a pension for longer than what was predicted. We did have a mortality gain this year. It was about similarly sized to a loss last year. So it's nice to have a table that's predicting both gains and losses that are not of a great magnitude. Very small loss on disability retirement. That was one last year that was like one of the smallest gain loss items I've ever seen, particularly for a plan this size, rounded down to 0. Salaries continue to be higher than expected, so that shows up here as salary losses. So we had a $14 million salary loss. The COLA we knew, as we talked about, that was higher than what was projected, what was assumed. So we have another COLA loss that's driven by the 1-year inflation that we've factored in. And then miscellaneous traps things like it collects things like movements in like unexpected show ups in the retiree group, retirees that are new retirees that are retiring with a benefit that's higher. So a lot of times that's purchases of service. So they're coming in with some service that wasn't anticipated in the valuation process. They're also paying for that amount. So they're in the contributions side, there's some amount that's theoretically supposed to kind of offset that part of it, but that's not a liability issue. So it shows up as a bigger liability loss than it probably is to the system, because there's money out there that's being paid for things like the service purchases. But overall, with the investment gain of $22 million, that just netted out to a total system loss for the year of $26 million. Any questions on that? Tim, you unmuted, but
Yeah, Matt, the one thing that I was struck by this table is how it really does, I think, match with my understanding of the environment here in Vermont right now. Like when you look at a loss in retirement and a gain in turnover, that means more people are generally leaving, whether they're leaving to retire or leaving in the middle of a career. That's how that would show up. And I think that's, not inconsistent with the earlier slide where we showed a net loss in the overall number of active teachers, but also just that we know that there's a little bit more turnover in the workforce. And with respect to the salary, that's a bit of a sizable loss there. But I think, what we've seen post-COVID, when inflation spiked, that the salary kind of lagged that. And so after the big run up in inflation, then you saw some higher numbers in contracts. And then the COLA, of course, makes sense as because we have actual data to that. And so what really struck me with this year's valuation was how it all made sense. Like sometimes you see numbers that
finally,
well, sometimes you see numbers that you're like, well, I don't understand why that's like that, but this really seems to all be what I would have generally expected. And I don't know if others in the workforce have similar thoughts, but just my 2 cents on this table.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's kind of the thought process that we use when we're going through it. If something we think should look like this and it comes out that it does, then it kind of passes one of our smell checks. And if it doesn't, if we're getting 20 million of retirement losses, but it looks like there were fewer retirements than expected, then we dive in, and either find out there's a problem or we talk to you and we figure out that something else happened that caused it. But that's all kind of our reconciliation process, as well as do these numbers make sense? Really the last slide is, this was an additional disclosure that was required for the first time last year. And it's part of a revision to one of the actuarial standards of practice that for a long time there was a debate of, we're carrying this accrued liability that we're reporting out there. And it's discounted based on our long-term assumption. And as actuaries, as public sector actuaries, we view the liability of the system as being a going concern, and we're kind of cash flow matching, and we expect assets to earn 7%. So we discount those liabilities, those payments at 7%, because we want to figure out the amounts. The schedule before, where we showed the amortization, we have an unfunded in 2037 that we have the amortization payment, and then those exactly offset to be a projected zero. So it all kind of makes mathematical sense. But financial economists view pensions as a risk-free enterprise. So you're not, none of your members are at this point are subject to the market downturns. It's a promised benefit. And so their point is that, well, you can't discount something that has no risk, a payment that has no risk, at a risky rate. You should be evaluating a riskless pension payment, at a risk-free interest rate. So there was a big debate that went on for many years, and the compromise was this reporting of a low default risk obligation measure in actuarial valuations. And so it was really it was a compromise. Just, we caveat it and we put it in our risk section, or actually close to the risk section, but in the report, and we describe, if we were to value the liability, which is $4.79 billion, if we were to value that at a lower, a more, high quality fixed income. So basically, if your plan was entirely invested in high quality fixed income securities, approximating like a risk-free rate, that discount rate that we would be using based on our indice would have been 5.2% instead of 7%, and that would cause the liability to be $5.93 billion. And so that was a number that they kind of wanted reported along with all these other metrics to kind of show just an alternative view. And we sort of caveat the 5.9 in the report by saying, this is what would happen if VPIC was invested entirely in high quality fixed income securities, but they're not. Part of their strategy is to take on risk, and there's people that study what the risk tolerance of the systems can be, and you are invested in a risky portfolio, and that is saving the taxpayers, over $1 billion of money on a present value basis, because you've got this strategy to invest money in order to pay, to offset contributions. You want to offset them with investment return. And the reason I wanted to, talk about this again is this mark-to-market interest rate. Last year's slide, when we showed this, that rate was 3.93%, and this year it's up to 5.2%. So I think last year's liability was like 6.7 billion, and here we're showing 5.9 billion. So again, when you mark liabilities to market on one of these indexes that change every year, you can get a pretty wide swing in liabilities. So just to note that if anyone kind of wants to talk about this number, it was a lot bigger number last year, the liability was, and that's because the indices were lower as of last year's snapshot than they were this year. And that's pretty much the end of our report. If there's any other questions, we'd be happy to take those.
Thank you.
Sure, I'll stop sharing.
It's wonderful to have a conversation when the numbers work.
It's true.
Oh, this report is fantastic, and as we said earlier, this is playing out since Act 114, that the strategies are working, and we need to stay the course.
And just to highlight what that course is, over the course of the next, starting in the springtime, we'll be working with Siegel on our next experience study on that 3-year cadence. And so that'll be the next opportunity to kind of revisit all of the assumptions. And, I'm sure where you saw those, things like retirement and areas where there have been a persistent loss, you can probably expect us to focus heavily on those assumptions and seeing whether or not we need to adjust those. And so that'll be the work that we're doing in the spring and summer. And I would expect we'll maintain the schedule that we followed last go round. And so that would bring to you an experience study in September for review. And then that would be in advance of the next year's valuation.
Excellent.
So, Mr. Chair, as Matt said,
I assume we have a motion?
Yeah, there are some motions. Happy to talk more in depth about anything in the valuation, but if I could share my screen. Since Act 114, we've been following a series of 3 motions that we make with the valuations. And so we wrote them down here for your review. And these are the motions that we would recommend as a result of this valuation.
Excellent. Do we have a board
I
member
would-
comfortable with the first motion?
I would be happy to make the motion.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second, George.
Okay. Discussion on the motion? All those in favor of the motion to accept the 2025 VSTRS actuarial report as presented by Siegel, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. On to the second motion. Do we have
So
someone?
moved.
Thank you. A second?
Second, George.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And our final motion,
So moved.
second?
Hamby
second.
second. Oh, or George.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Further discussion on the final motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Outstanding.
Great. Well, next step will be for a letter from the treasurer to the Governor and General Assembly recommending these numbers. So thank you very much for your attention to this.
Excellent. Okay. I want to thank Siegel and the team for an outstanding report. Once again, well explained. The layout is a great improvement over reports of the past that I have read. And the presentation, in conjunction with the report itself, the evaluation it's great just to be able to jump between the 2 documents. So I thank you for all your hard work. And I also thank the Treasurer's Office and your team, Tim, to get this all together for us.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, last item on the agenda. Any other business to come before the board?
Mr. Chair, I'll just use this time to remind folks of our November 12th in-person meeting. Really excited to have you come down to the Treasurer's Office. And we'll have, I think Bill has already sent an RSVP out, so if folks could do that so we could plan, that'd be great. And then we will send around a memo with some details as well in advance. So please look for that. And we'll try and get that out later today. And then, yeah, really excited to have you in person for another meeting.
Excellent. Excellent. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Hamby motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjournment, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Enjoy the sun while we have it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent work.